Hi everyone, I'm Pam Bador, and I want to talk to you today about writing effective introductions and conclusions for your papers. Okay, let's be honest. For most of us, writing an introduction is an especially tough task. You want to start the paper off by making a good impression, but that's hard to do until you have a sense of the whole paper. Also, you know that the first and last paragraphs of a paper are especially important since they frame the paper and have an outsized impact on the reader as the first and last thing they read. So there's a certain amount of stress involved in the introduction, but also, depending on your writing process, you might still be doing a lot of thinking while you're writing, so you might not actually be ready to write the intro until you've written at least part of the paper. I personally like to write some kind of introduction before I start writing a paper, but it's always just a tentative intro. I know full well that once I have a full draft, I will come back and either make major revisions or write a whole new introduction. In this podcast, I want to cover the purpose of an introduction and of a conclusion, and to talk through a couple writing strategies that might help you work on these very important paragraphs. So, an introduction has three main purposes. If you're writing a fairly short paper, under 10 pages, think of your introduction as just your first paragraph. If you're writing a longer paper, you might find that your intro is 2 or 3 paragraphs, so just make sure you fulfill these purposes in the introductory section. So, the purposes are, in shorthand, 1. Justification, 2. Context, and 3. Thesis. There's a fourth purpose too, although it's optional, for the hook. Okay, so your introduction should provide a justification for the paper by setting up a question that will be answered or a problem that will be solved. If you're using outside sources, you might use them to justify your paper, maybe by setting up a debate that exists in current scholarship that you will be settling, or by telling the reader how you will challenge or extend one of your sources. In a literary analysis, the justification is often to provide readers with an insight into a novel or film that they might not have had on a first reading. So figure out a way to justify why that insight matters, what it gives your reader. Another way to think about the justification or rationale for the paper is as answering the so what question. Why should I want to read your paper? So what? The second purpose is to provide your reader whatever context they need to understand your paper. If you're writing about a novel or film, you might want to provide a few key details about the plot, the setting, or the characters, so they will understand why your argument is insightful. You can also provide context about the analytical approach you're using, whether that's eco-criticism or feminism or whatever. The key to providing context is asking yourself, what does my reader need to know to understand the thesis? Which brings us to point 3. The introduction sets up the thesis. As we've discussed, a thesis must be debatable in order to be a thesis. Some thesis statements are just clearly debatable, but sometimes you need to provide a bit of context to show that your thesis is debatable. Although your thesis doesn't absolutely need to be the last line of your introduction, that's a pretty common place for it, since that's a good way to wrap up the intro and lead into the body of your paper. But trust yourself. If it feels like you have another sentence or two, context or justification probably, that should go after the thesis, go with it. The fourth optional purpose of the introduction can be to hook the reader. This is more necessary in journalism or public scholarship, since you need a title and introduction that will cause readers to click on your story. If you have a great opening line for an academic paper, definitely use it. But if you don't worry about it too much. A great opening line might be a pithy statement, a controversial statement, an engaging question, or a quotation, among other things. Whether or not you feel like you have a great hook, I do want to caution against opening with a generalization. Big statements that start with throughout human history or since the beginning of time are usually too broad to really engage the reader and too general to do much of the work of setting up the context and providing the justification. They can also feel a bit tired to your reader. So whether you're writing your introduction first or last, those are the purposes you want to cover. The conclusion really only has 2 purposes. 1, summary, and 2, impression. People sometimes suggest that a good conclusion also provides a new idea, but I'm not really committed to that. In general, I feel like if you have a great new idea, make it part of the paper. Conclusions can be short. In fact, there is something to be said for the short, forceful concluding paragraph. You want to summarize your paper's key arguments and contributions in a way that wraps up your argument and helps your reader see what you've accomplished in your paper. And you want to leave a good impression, which you will do if you've accomplished your task of developing and supporting your thesis throughout the paper. Look at that. I just explained the main purposes of a conclusion in a pretty concise way. That would probably be a good place to conclude this little podcast. But no, I also want to talk through a couple strategies for accomplishing the purposes of intros and conclusions. From a process perspective, consider writing your introduction and/or conclusion last. Or if you like to write the introduction first, go back with a willingness to revise it after you've written through the supporting paragraphs of your paper. Also, when you have a complete draft of the introduction and conclusion, put them side by side and try to see them from the reader's point of view. Are there ideas in the conclusion that would be helpful to the reader in the introduction, or vice versa? Is there a clear and logical line of reasoning that runs from the intro to the conclusion? I'm sure we've all had the experience of writing an excellent statement of the thesis in the conclusion. That makes sense in terms of writing process, since as you work through your evidence and analysis, the thesis might get clearer and more nuanced in your mind so that you're finally ready to state it perfectly only when you're writing the very last paragraph. If that happens, consider moving that beautifully stated thesis from the conclusion to the introduction, where it can then drive your paper. Also, always pay special attention to both the introduction and the conclusion when you're doing your final edits. Consider reading them aloud or getting feedback from a friend. Not to put too much pressure on these two little paragraphs, but they can have a major impact on how excited readers are to dive into your paper and how impressed they are when they've reached the end. Happy writing!